Hello, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining me for what should be an important discussion that we have at the moment. I've got Susan Langlois. I've interviewed her since 2022, and we had another conversation almost 2 years ago. But she's unique because she has a deep understanding of the industry, and she's not afraid to talk about what she knows. In truth, this may be one of those interviews that you may never hear again in terms of the depth and detail of knowledge that she's going to share. And I think that what we do is we'll go through the process. I'll ask everybody who's here, please just let us know where you're from. I love to share where people are listening from. And as we go through, if you have any really good questions, I'll look out for them as well. So, without any further ado, let's bring Susan to the stage. Thank you, Susan. The first thing I'd ask you to do is to just give an introduction of yourself to the audience.
Thank you so much for having me. This will be a very interesting discussion, I think. And so, my background: I started in 1972 working for. I'm going to name the company Connaught Laboratories because I'm very proud of my 20 years there. And I concentrated on regulatory approvals for vaccines and biotherapeutics. I also was involved in clinical trials and the quality management of the products. So that really is, in a nutshell, my background in that industry. I then moved on to medical devices that were combined with biotech products. But I think more importantly, during the pandemic, I became a professional volunteer. I started off in 2017 as a volunteer for a local hospital. And as the years progressed, I think I was into my fourth year, I was asked to participate in a number of committees that were both part of the hospital and our Ontario Health team. Now, in Ontario, we have teams that combine all the health organizations within a geographic area. And in our area, it included the hospital, the family clinics, private doctors, dentists, our food bank. So everybody that's involved in the health of our taxpayers or our citizens are part of that team. So I was involved in helping them earn the designation for our region. I was on the ethics committee. I was on the hospital's patient advisory committee. I was the chair of the patient advisory committee to the Ontario Health team. I was consulted by the provincial Ontario Health on a number of subjects. And I was also then volunteering physically within the hospital. And I think I put we counted about 30 hours a week just volunteering.
I think it's important here, Susan, to position that you worked in industry for 45 years. You developed vaccines in your company. You were part of the regulation for it. You are definitely not anti-vax. What is one of your most proud developments when you were working in an industry and bringing forth vaccines that could benefit the public?
Well, I think there are a lot of different things that I'm proud of, but the one thing that always sticks with me is the BCG vaccine that we had developed and were distributing all over the world for prevention of tuberculosis. And there were some researchers in the US and Canada that looked at that particular bacterium as a way to treat bladder cancer. Their concept was to instill the vaccine at high concentrations into the bladder, and the bacteria would attach to the cancer cells, and then the body's immune system would attack the bacteria and at the same time attack the cancer cells. The company wasn't really interested. We're talking about Connaught now. They weren't really interested at the time in developing this because we were not a company that marketed or developed therapeutics. We were looking at anything that prevented disease. One of the other was we developed insulin. Of course, everybody knows I think the story of Banting and Best, and then the insulin was licensed to Connaught, who developed it and marketed it. But they weren't really interested, and they said to me, if you think that this product can be approved by the regulators in Canada and the US, that's the FDA and Health Canada, you can go ahead and work with these researchers and get it approved. So I did. It took us 11 months to pull all the data together, understand that the vaccine was already approved. So we're using something that had been approved, and the safety and effectiveness of developing antibodies was determined, but the safety and efficacy of using it to treat cancer had not. So these researchers had conducted several clinical trials in thousands of people, and they were basically placebo-controlled trials because these patients, there was no other way to treat that particular cancer. It was in situ carcinoma is what we were talking about.
Mhm.
So that did get approved, and that's something that I'm quite proud of.
Wow. The reason I did that is because I want to demonstrate your deep interest and focus in the industry. And it therefore raises a personal question, is that you standing up and raising questions, as we will do as we continue the conversation, could almost be viewed as negative to the industry. Why are you risking the reputation of the industry that you love and have worked for so long by just asking these difficult questions?
I look at it slightly differently. I'm looking at it, I'm trying to save the industry because there are some companies that have taken advantage of the COVID pandemic, and there are others that stood back and did things properly. And because of the errors in judgment that have been made by both the regulators and the pharmaceutical companies, there's a lot of distrust or mistrust of the companies that really are doing things properly and are quite happy to do studies, long-term studies, safety studies before they market their products. So by asking these questions and pointing out things that were not done properly during the pandemic, I'm hoping to educate people into looking at the companies that are more honest and not looking at the bottom line.
You're still in touch with people in industry. What are they saying behind the scenes about what is happening on the ground for them?
Well, I think the company that I did work with, I know that they had the RNA, they have an RNA platform, an mRNA platform for vaccines. And they are doing studies to look at the safety and effect of those vaccines, long-term studies. And they weren't ready to launch the product when COVID was it turned into a pandemic. And they also weren't mandating the vaccines that were available to their staff. And that is something that makes me think that the ones that are working in companies like that are very upset with what's been happening in some of these bigger companies that, just take advantage. So I think when you ask what do they say, they are still very proud of what they're working on. They do believe there will be mRNA vaccines, but they won't look anything like the ones that have been released and distributed for COVID.
And they are suffering the impact of the loss of trust
Yes.
because at the moment, the loss of trust is huge. Public health, pharma sector. I was saying early in the pandemic that the damage to the reputation of the pharmaceutical industry would be huge in the pandemic. And I was saying, why is pharma sitting quietly while only a few companies take the pickings and destroy the reputation? What was wrong with them? Why didn't they stand up and raise the questions?
That's a good question. Actually, I don't have the answer to that one. I don't think I've asked myself that question. But just if I was sitting as part of those, so just so people know, I am retired. I have been retired for 10 years. So I don't have a career to worry about. My reputation, it could be damaged by these things I'm saying, but it's not the same as the people that are still working or even consulting as part of their retirement plan. Um, I think that those companies that didn't speak out, again, were looking at the industry in a whole. And if they condemned other pharma companies, those that, if you don't work in the company, you wouldn't believe that they are not any different from the rest. It's like, well, they're just trying to knock down their competition. They're trying to, um, you know, damn them or badmouth the competition, and that's how people, I think, would look at it. So in the pharmaceutical industry, you very rarely attack your competition because it will just turn right back on you, and they'll do the same thing to your company.
There's a big question that keeps on coming up, and I'm going to show you before we get into some of the things, just to show you what industry public health is up against. They are not vaccines, so she's wrong about that.
I'll
And
answer that. I'll
yeah,
answer.
we'll answer that. But here is an important question. Has COVID caused us to need to do a reassessment of the whole vaccine industry in relation to where are the benefits, where are the risks? Has that now brought us to a new phase of looking at it?
I would hope it has. Recall a smallpox vaccine. That was probably one of the last times they did an assessment, a risk benefit assessment, where you look at these are healthy people, right? These are people you're vaccinating that are healthy. They don't have a disease you need to treat. You're trying to prevent a disease that they may never get, they may never come in contact with. So smallpox was eradicated. Some people argue the vaccine had no role in that. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the role was or the reason for it being eradicated. It was eradicated, and there was a review of the risk benefit of smallpox vaccine. And they started to realize that the risks of the vaccine were much greater than the risks of getting smallpox, which is basically nil. So they took that vaccine off the market. I don't think they've done it since then. You have polio vaccines, same thing. The majority of the cases of polio are not wild polio. They're caused by oral polio vaccine, which is given orally, passes through the gut, and when it comes out the other end, it's infectious, and grandparents and brothers and sisters can get it. So the last, I think, polio case in Canada, or maybe even North America, was in the 70s, and it was caused by a vaccine. Not so you have to think, should we be evaluating the risk benefits of polio vaccine? Now, there are vaccines like tetanus in a developed country. Do you need tetanus and diphtheria? So I do hope that they will sit back and start evaluating. But again, if the pharmaceutical companies push or lobby for that not being done because they continue to sell these vaccines, then I don't know who will actually conduct those analyses.
So here is coming to the crunch of the question, as Anna Sell had asked. Technically, do you believe in the mRNA technology as a vaccine currently being used across the world? What are your thoughts on this?
I'd like to answer that question by combining it with the previous question about
Yeah,
mRNA. Is it a vaccine?
yeah,
So let me just start with when they first announced, I think it was Trump that announced that they were going to have a vaccine within 10 months. I assumed at that time they were talking about the traditional vaccines. So a new flu vaccine or formulation is issued every year. And that's because the platform has been approved, and all they have to do is grow the new variant or the new strain in the same platform they've used for years. And then they put that out and they can do that within 6 months. I've been in the company where we made two different strains of vaccines within the same year. So if it was made using the old formulation, which is basically you either grow the virus up or the bacteria in some medium, and then you extract it and inactivate it so you don't actually get the disease, and then you inject that in. So you're actually injecting the antigen that causes the disease. When I then found out a month or so later that two of the vaccines that they were offering were going to be mRNA vaccines, I'm going to put it this way, but my spidey sense started to activate because I thought, wait a minute, they have never approved an mRNA vaccine because of safety and efficacy concerns. Why are they doing now, and why are they doing it within 9 months? So I started to look into what that mRNA vaccine was. And I looked at the difference between the mRNA and a regular vaccine. So with a regular vaccine, you're injecting the antigen or the component that causes the disease in a muscle, or you're giving it orally and it's going through the gut, but you're giving the entirety or at least pieces of it in a liquid. And when you're injecting it, it stays within that spot, and the body then attacks it, creating antibodies to that antigen. The mRNA is different. They're injecting an mRNA that is training the cells to manufacture a piece, the spike protein, and the body now reacts to that. So you can't expect that that's going to stay where you put it. This is now encased in a lipid capsule. So then I looked a little bit further and I thought, okay, why is this not being regulated as a genetic therapy? Because it is messenger RNA. And I realized that back in 2013, the regulators clarified that an mRNA product that would induce an immune response would not be regulated as a genetic product. It will be regulated as a vaccine. And that's when I really became suspicious, because I realized they were going to, that basically set the stage for these mRNA vaccines that had been around for a long time. They were trying to develop them, but they had all these issues with them. But it set the stage for them being regulated as a vaccine instead of a genetic product, a genetic therapeutic. What that meant was that for vaccines, the standard vaccines, you focus on safety in healthy people. So that's got to be really safe. You look at safety and you look at its ability to protect against a disease. With a genetic product, under the genetic regulations, there are 4 things they concentrate on. And one is carcinogenicity, which is, does it cause cancer or can it actually accelerate cancer? Distribution, which means where does the product go? They call it ADME studies. So you've got absorption, metabolism, you've got excretion and distribution. And then the last thing they look at is long-term patient follow-up. So those are 4 areas that are not included in vaccine regulation. They don't look at those because it's an antigen that's being injected and it is killed off almost immediately. The body attacks it gets rid of it. The other thing that, sorry,
I just wanted
I'm
to
very,
ask you something there before you went on. They made this change in 2013.
yes.
What was the logic of making the change in 2013? Was it
Well,
that,
sorry.
yeah, I'm trying now to think back. Uh, What was, because in effect, if they had not made that change, there would have been no way to use the platform in the pandemic.
Correct. Correct. And all I can assume, and this is an assumption, this is not from anything that I have proof of, that the companies already were working on these vaccines. They knew they'd never get them approved as they are using them as genetics, right? Using the regulations that required that they prove all these things, because they wouldn't have been able to do it. They probably were just waiting for an opportunity like the COVID pandemic to bring it on the market. And so to me, um, drug companies do a lot of lobbying with the regulators. And there's a lot of money there. There's a lot of money to be had. The regulators wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the money that the pharmaceutical companies give them. They pay for reviews, they pay for inspections. Companies feed into that whole system. So when they lobby for changes to regulations, quite often it happens. There's enough pressure on the regulators. I mean, they'll have all kinds of the good rationale, and if the regulators aren't really thinking about what the real reason is for them to do it, they will say, well, this makes sense because they're going to be using this to induce an antibody response. They're not treating a cancer or some other genetic disease with this. So yeah, we can probably regulate it as a vaccine.
You do realize that there are a lot of people across the world who cannot understand why people are still concerned about the mRNA technology. It has been used in billions across the world. If there were any safety issues, would it not be seen by now? That's effectively what people say.
Okay, well, it has been seen. And one, okay, so here's another. So the other part of all of this was the dose. The difference between the two types of technology. So with a standard vaccine, the potency of the dose is one of the most important things besides safety. And that means that every vial, from vial to vial, batch to batch, the same number of antigens are in that dose. So everybody that gets that vaccine gets the same number of these components injected in the muscle. And for vaccines, the company has to do these tests and submit the results, and the regulators test the vaccines and confirm the results. And when I was working at Connaught, we also distributed through UNICEF, so WHO also tested for the potency. Now that was a very important component, that everybody got the same dose. But that didn't mean that everybody reacted to the dose the same way. It depended on the state of that person's immune system. So if you've got a very poor immune system, you may not develop any antibodies at all. Now, when you talk about the mRNA, that's completely different. That RNA is going into cells and instructing the cells to produce that antigen. And some people won't produce any of the spike protein, and others will produce too much. And we don't know how long that keeps going on, how long those little manufacturing plants continue to work. They've not done those studies. I haven't seen any results of those studies. So that's another great big huge. So for instance, the regulators can't test for potency. Every dose, you would get a different dose from me because, as I said, it gets into the muscle, then it's got to get into cells, and the cells have to produce the antigen. And the antigen is only one piece, and it's a very toxic piece. It's the spike protein. It's not It's not an inactivated piece of bacteria or the virus. So that, to answer the question about why they haven't seen, I was watching all this and I knew, I think you brought me on in 2024 to discuss the concern of myocarditis in patients that have received the vaccine. And it was very early days and people were saying, oh, it wasn't the vaccine. Well, it's now become, there's proof that it causes myocarditis and sudden death. It took 5 years for the regulators to force the pharma to put that in their labeling as a warning. 5 years. So the regulators knew this. They should have recalled it. But there's one more component in all this, and that is the emergency release. So we have all these exemptions when they're being regulated as a vaccine that I've just described, the carcinogenicity and the persistence of effect and long-term studies and the distribution. But then they made up this emergency release regulation, which exempted the pharmaceutical companies from recall, informed consent, and liability. So not only did they take all these shortcuts and say, we didn't take any shortcuts. No, that is a lie by omission, because the shortcuts were already in the regulations. So by saying we didn't take any shortcuts, they didn't lie. They didn't take any shortcuts because they followed the regulations. But the regulations themselves had shortcuts. And then they put in the emergency drug release. Well, they can say we didn't take any shortcuts. We followed the regulations. Oh, and we did an intense review of what? What did they review? Because the emergency drug release doesn't require much data be submitted at all. They had 3 months of clinical data, and they actually crossed over the placebo and gave them all vaccines. So
Yeah,
it really
these
is.
are some huge issues. And I was just thinking as you were talking about the discussion I had with Christy Grace, who the people still don't want to listen to what she said. And she was talking about the fact that the ionizable lipids in the lipid nanoparticle, if they change their charge and they bind to normal proteins, will cause adduction, which has a genotoxic, I guess, carcinogenic properties. And this has not really been tested. Now, but the reality is it seems as though industry has just moved on.
Mm-hmm.
Is it reasonable? Because this is what we're being told, that the better outcomes than doing placebo controlled and so on is the fact that you have vaccinated so many people. We're still getting studies coming out in the past week demonstrating that those who are getting their boosters had, I think, a 40% lower risk of cardiovascular events. Now, truthfully, when I saw that, I thought that makes no sense, because we know that at least it causes myocarditis. The best you could consider would be neutral. So there must be something else going on. However, this is what the research is showing. The industry is getting the support it needs, and all the evidence is pointing to the fact that this is fine. Why are you still talking about it?
My response to that is the only definitive proof are placebo-controlled studies. That you can't use I know the data is suggestive, and I believe that the vaccine does cause a lot of damage. But without a placebo-controlled long-term studies, you will never have the definitive information. So there will be no proof. And these pharmaceutical companies, the regulators, are right in saying we've given it to billions of people and there's no signal. The signals are there, but you can't call it proof because it wasn't placebo controlled. So coming back to placebo controlled studies, one of my early concerns was that once they got these mRNA vaccines for COVID, without having, because they should have been recalled by now. Like, they really should have been recalled, but they were exempt from recall by these emergency drug release. So even though the regulators may admit to themselves there were problems, they aren't going to recall it. And if they did, that would cause a complete failure of the whole medical system, because that's saying that they vaccinated all these people with a product that was unsafe. So there'll never be placebo-controlled safety studies, never. They'll never do them. And they are now grandfathered, so they are now producing almost every new vaccine, and even flu vaccine, using this technology. And they will never be required to conduct additional studies, because the regulators are convinced this is safe, and therefore any vaccine produced using this safe platform will be safe. And that was my concern right from the get-go, that without those studies, they'll never be done. They'll never be done. They've got 5-6 years that they can say we've been giving this, but you have to even look at the way they are tracking the adverse events. Like, they're not tracking them the way they should. They should be tracked as if it was a post-marketing clinical trial, where every patient that gets the product is identified and tracked. That's not what they're doing, because this was based on an emergency, and people just get the vaccine. And the only reporting is if you go to your doctor and say, I've had an adverse effect, then they may or may not report it on your behalf. There is nobody that's forcing anybody to go to their doctor and admit it. So we don't know. We have no idea. And the only ones you have, because I'll admit I'm not vaccinated. My husband's not vaccinated. My son and his family didn't get vaccinated. We appear to be healthier than our friends that did get vaccinated. We have lost 3 people in our family due to cancer, and 1 to a heart attack shortly after getting their 3rd booster. That's circumstantial. I cannot prove that the vaccine caused it.
It's very interesting that you raised this, because I was just looking at a case report. I haven't presented it yet, for a patient who had a stroke within 24 hours of being vaccinated. But he had background vascular risk factors. So, maybe hypertension, some other conditions, probably on medication. And what was clear is that there is no way in a patient like that you could say this was because of the vaccine.
Right.
It is virtually impossible, because somebody would just say, how do you know? So when the threshold is so high to then prove that this is a direct cause, it means the only way that this can be done properly is proper post-marketing pharmacovigilance. Now, what's very interesting is that this can still be done, because certainly, say, for instance, in the UK, everyone's vaccination records are visibly tied to their NHS records. So you could retrospectively go back and look at any condition and look and see whether or not there was a change in terms of the vaccinated cohorts and timeframes. But there does not seem to be any appetite to do this kind of work, largely because it has already been shown to be safe. How do you square this circle?
Square the circle. I like that. The thing is, they are saying it's been shown to be safe because they've given it, the rationale for that is they've given it to billions of people. And they feel that the few people that reported that they had a stroke or a heart attack or cancer is not justified in taking it off the market, because they believe it saved people's lives. And I have to say, when we were going through various waves here in my little town. I can't remember if it was the 4th wave. I can't remember, but we only had about 20% vaccinated at that point, and they'd only had 1 dose. And when the wave, petered off, the government credited the vaccine for that. Like, look at this. we stopped that wave. And thinking, but how can you stop a wave when there's only 20% of the population had one dose? So they use those kind of things to say we saved lives. And therefore, the risk benefit, they'll say we saved all these lives, but so we killed a few people. You know, the risk benefit is still in favor of this vaccine, but it's not, because if you're giving it to healthy people, because even the people that have the bad hearts and the diabetes and obese, they're still not, they don't have COVID. They're not sick yet of COVID. So I still consider giving the vaccine to healthy people, because you don't want to make them worse with the product that you're giving them. So even somebody that has these coexisted conditions, you have to look and say, but did I make it worse? And they didn't look at that.
I'm going to ask you an important, it just popped into my head, and I haven't shared this data yet, really. But I looked at the UK NHS hospital episode admissions, and I was able to get it analyzed using AI. I mean, 186 million data points.
Wow.
And it came up with some stuff that was unbelievable. And one of the standout things was the huge rise in pregnancy, gestational hypertension, preeclampsia. I think it was 4 or 5 things together that were like an absolute red flag. This is really unusual. Can they justify how it has been used in pregnancy? What are your thoughts? Because the reality was, at the time, there was a higher risk of people who are pregnant getting into hospital with respiratory problems, especially in the 3rd trimester. So they did feel they had to do something. But when you think about it from a regulatory point of view, how is that perceived in the industry normally?
Okay, so I'm going to take us back to when these products were first approved. I know how to get into the regulatory websites and find the actual data that supported the approval. And for both the mRNA vaccines, they actually said in the documents that these vaccines should not be given to pregnant women, lactating women, women who are attempting to become pregnant. It should not be given to people with autoimmune conditions. There were a number of contraindications, and the rationale for it was because we haven't studied those groups. We haven't looked at those groups. It was the government and the pharmaceutical company. So the labeling that went out, there's an information brochure, and it actually had that in. And how do I know it had that in? Because in our town, we set up the vaccination clinics, and I was involved in setting those up. Because we had to look at patient flow. You know, you have somebody come in, you don't want somebody that just got vaccinated going out the same way. So you have patient flow. I asked to see the consent form first thing. Well, we're not doing informed consent. We've been exempted from that. So I said, so the patients don't know the risks that they're taking. All they know is the benefit that this is going to stop the pandemic, because that's what the government was saying. It's going to stop the spread. It's going to stop infection. And we're going to end the pandemic with these vaccines. So then I said, so let me see the information brochure that identified the groups that you should not be vaccinating. Well, we weren't given that. The government didn't give us the information brochure when they gave us the vaccines. So the vaccines were shipped from the pharmaceutical companies to the government, and the government then dispensed it out to all these vaccination clinics. So I said, but you're not supposed to be giving it to the pregnant women. Or I said, I've got an autoimmune condition. So that's, she says, well, we're not allowed to accept any exemptions. So somebody being pregnant is not a valid exemption. or somebody with an autoimmune condition. So I started to look at Ontario and the rest of Canada. Same thing was happening all across. I don't know about the US. I do know in Ontario, for sure, I know that the people giving these shots were not given the information. So that's one side of it. Why did the regulators allow that to happen? Why did the pharmaceutical companies not say you need to hand out these information brochures because that's part of our approval? I don't know. I have no idea why. I can assume a lot of reasons why, but it was right there in the approval process that they knew they shouldn't be giving the vaccine to those groups, and they did anyway.
This is, I mean, what's fascinating is so many countries have done their inquisitions. You know, the UK has done theirs. I think Canada has done theirs. I think New Zealand has done theirs. I don't know if one has happened in the US.
The US is doing it now.
Is doing it now. Nobody's finding any problems. They're not raising any of these questions. What is going on? It's this, and this is what I'm saying is that when it comes to trust, I usually use the analogy trust is like glass. Once you break it, you can't stick it back together. And at the moment, they are not able to convince the public, and rightly so, because fundamentally the appropriate studies have not been done. As I said, with Christy Grace and adduction, we know these studies have not been done. And as you have highlighted, the perspective is let's just move on. How can trust be built? And fundamentally, are we putting the public at greater risk?
Yes, we are putting the public at greater risk. I worked, like I said, 45 years in the industry, and I always respected the regulators. I knew a lot of them personally. I knew the jobs that they were doing. I don't know what's happened to them. All I know is in the years that I was working in the industry, there wasn't as much influence brought onto them by the politicians, by the companies. There was no funding coming from the pharmaceutical companies. That happened, I guess, in the maybe late 80s, early 90s, when there wasn't enough money to support the regulators doing the job. So they came up with this idea, well, we can get the pharma to pay for services. Services being pay for the review of their submissions, pay for the audits, the inspections of their facilities, the testing of their products. So it was pay for services. But once you do that, once you start taking money from the people you're trying to regulate, how can you have any independence? Because those people understand that their jobs are there because of the money coming from the pharmaceutical industry. And when you get big companies, big pharma companies, they put in a lot of money because they have a lot of products that they are trying to get through the system. So my way of looking at things is follow the money. And every time you do that, whether it be a study, whether it be an approval, whether it be the government forcing certain things on us, somebody is either gaining a position of power or financial gain. And that's the only explanation I have for any of what's occurred.
I think it's important to get some degree of balance with regards to the mRNA platform, meaning that in terms of what it does with triggering an immune response and the speed that industry is able to adjust things gives some huge advantages. And as you pointed out, there are some companies that are going the long, slow, placebo-controlled, detailed route to ensure that there is safety. And so the platform itself may still be very valuable. The truth is, I still have some questions with regards to a long-term immunity, because when we looked at the COVID vaccines, the bone marrow just does not make long-term immune cells with mRNA vaccines, I think that's a big red flag. I don't know if it's because of the spike protein or because of the platform. As we said, the adduction things need to be questioned. But what do you think is the potential of the platform if done properly?
Um, I'm not sure that it should be used for vaccines. I was very excited about the platform being used for cancer because that makes sense. You inject an mRNA that can then make something to attack a tumor attack cancer cells in a solid tumor. But once you talk about it going, it's a systemic type of, which is what happened here. It didn't stay in the muscle. It's going everywhere because it's encapsulated. So it's not like when you inject it into a muscle and the antibodies are attacking it. There's nothing to attack it, really. That's why they encapsulated the way they did, so that the body wouldn't react to it. It would give time for that mRNA to enter the cells before the immune system attacked it. So an mRNA on its own is also a problem. It's got toxicity. It disappears very quickly. And the original research on that demonstrated that it wasn't going to work as a vaccine. They thought they solved the problem by encapsulating it with this nanoparticles. But that itself might be the problem. It might be it might be that encapsulation that's causing all of these problems. It may have nothing to do with the mRNA, but without those studies, we'll never know. So I'm not supportive of this as a vaccine. I still think it's if they're going to use it as a vaccine, then send it back to the drawing board, to the genetic regulations. Do all those studies. Look at the carcinogenicity. Look at the distribution. Treat it like that, and then if they can show us that all of that is, they've fixed the problems with all that, or at least eliminated the concerns, then come back to it. But to just keep pushing it the way it is right now without understanding it, and that's the problem, is nobody understands it, including the regulators and the pharmaceutical companies. They have no idea how it's really working.
You are the first person I heard talk about grandfathering of the technology. And I think it's worthwhile just explaining to the public what exactly you mean when you say grandfathering of the technology.
Okay, so this term, back in the early 70s, when I first got involved in regulatory affairs, I was a lab technologist. And there was no such thing as regulatory affairs back then. You just had a product and you put it on the market. And once you showed the regulators that you had used it in a certain number of people, you were allowed to continue. In the 70s, FDA and Health Canada decided they wanted to have the companies that had their products out there pull together information. So you had to pull together the manufacturing processes, the testing you did, any clinical data that you had on it, distribution data, adverse event reporting. So what they said then was, if your product had been on the market for several years and there had not been any safety concerns, and we're talking about vaccines now because that was the company I worked for, and you had tested that it developed antibodies as a response to that vaccine, you would be grandfathered. And what they meant by that is you won't have to do anything else. You just submit the data you have, even if it was very limited, and you can continue to market that product. Then they then put in place any new product. You now have to do all these studies of, animal studies and clinical trials, and submit your manufacturing data. And if you made one change in your manufacturing process, you had to conduct another trial. You had to conduct another trial that looked at safety and its ability to create antibodies or develop antibodies. Efficacy was a different study. You did that on the very first one, and that meant you had to go into an endemic area and compare unvaccinated with vaccinated and see how many people actually got the disease in an area where flu was prevalent or polio was prevalent. Um, so that grandfathering clause came up way back then. And it was basically, if you already have it on the market and we feel that it's been demonstrated to be safe and effective, you don't have to do anything more. So my concern was that the mRNA platform, just as using we had monkey kidney cells we used to grow polio vaccine in, right? So you didn't have to demonstrate that the monkey kidney cell line was safe. You had already done that with your first vaccine. So if you wanted to use it for measles or something else, all you have to do is to show the measles virus had been inactivated properly and was safe to inject. But the cells, you didn't have to do anything about. So the mRNA, I consider that as to be a platform similar to a cell line in the old style vaccine. And once that got on the market, they consider that safe. And now all they got to do is plug in a different protein and you're way to the races.
So, just recently in the US Army, they no longer mandated the flu vaccines. And the news was highlighting that there was an outbreak of flu. I think one person may have died. I don't know if they died of flu. A number of people were hospitalized. And this is highlighting why we need these vaccines and the way to adjust them quickly. We have been seeing hantavirus, Ebola virus, all of these things around us. There is a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear. Why can't they just move on, as you've said, using the grandfather technique and just turn all the vaccines into mRNA?
And actually they have. That's what they're doing. The new flu vaccines and all these other vaccines and all those viruses will never become pandemics because they don't spread from person to person. They either spread, well, Ebola does. I have to say, yes, Ebola does, but it will not. It's such a bad virus. It kills its host so quickly that it will never become a pandemic. It may become epidemics or even just within a small village. Hantavirus, same thing. Now they're going after Lyme disease. They've got the scare here in Canada about Lyme disease. And from what I understand, the vaccines that they're developing, some of them are mRNA. So they're using these vaccines already to manufacture. And I'd be interested, and I don't know, because I don't know the story about the US military. Was it an mRNA vaccine that they were giving them, so they didn't mandate it because they were concerned that maybe some people would react or have a reaction to that mRNA? I don't know. I doubt it was the old vaccines. I think they're already starting to use the mRNA flu vaccines to vaccinate in the US.
I'm going to have to ask you a question that has been avoided by the mainstream, but we do have to reflect on the significance, especially in what you have said. Tulsi Gabbard has just in the past week and a half stated that the virus, Wuhan, was funded partly by the US and it was covered up with regards to it being a lab leak and so on. When we now look at the environment that we are in, is it an unreasonable question to ask whether or not this could be a financial strategy by industry to get this kind of technology platformed and grandfathered?
I mean, it is plausible. I have no evidence one way or the other. It is plausible that it was the whole pandemic was manufactured, but it's also plausible that they just waited for the right opportunity because we knew a pandemic was going to occur at some point. At least that's what people like Bill Gates said, that we're going to have a pandemic. So that the company just waited because they've been waiting since 2013 when the regulations were changed. I mean, that's a long wait for a company. to put those vaccines out. But why didn't they put a vaccine out before that? Why did they wait for an emergency like the pandemic to release it? So it's very all of it's very suspicious, and all these things are plausible, but I don't think we'll ever get any proof that it actually occurred that way.
I want you to show the audience, Susan, your diary.
My
And
diaries.
yeah, diaries.
Okay, so yes. Why did I keep diaries? I keep diaries on everything, and I kept diaries on when I worked at the first company. I'm a boater, so I've kept diaries on that. So when 2000, no, sorry, yeah, 2020, January, I started to see the numbers creeping up. I said to my husband, we were sitting watching TV, and I said, I'm going to start a new diary. And he said, what? I said, on this COVID, because I think it's going to be major. And the very first diary that I started was very small because I thought that's all I would need. It was this size. And now I'm to this size. And you see the thickness. So I started with a small one thinking, a few months and it's going to go away. I have 1, 2, 3, 5 of these, and you can see it's all handwritten. And I kept this diary with me everywhere I went. So if I was at a meeting, like one of these committee meetings, if I saw something on the news, I would document it as it occurred in these diaries. And so I can go back, and that's why I can't forget. I can't forget what was done. And so when we talk about, that information brochure, for instance, once the product was out in the market and they made a couple of changes, that information brochure disappeared from the internet. Like, it's gone. It's not part of the database. So now if you went to look for it, it would have the big warning about the myocarditis in there. It would probably say you need to think again about giving it to pregnant women. But those original ones, when you go to look for them, are gone. But I have it in here. I have everything that had every experience that I had. And I had a lot because my mother died during COVID and she was in a retirement home, and I had to navigate through that as a volunteer on all these committees. People in my family dying, people not allowing me to come to Christmas because I wasn't vaccinated, and our own government telling me that I shouldn't even be allowed into the emergency ward if I had an emergency because I was unvaccinated. I mean, all of this, anything somebody could have gotten, experienced during the pandemic, I did. And it's all in my diaries. And I said, I've got about 5, if not 7 of them. And as you can see, it's all handwritten. So it's, it's not, I'm not making this stuff up. This is, well, unless I spent 5 years making stuff up and writing it into books. But everything in there can be supported by historical events. And that's why I kept the diary, because I thought it's like Anne Frank's diary. Like, she kept that diary while she was going through that during the war, the Jewish girl. And that is still being read to this day because that is real time documentation.
Yeah, we're lucky to have people like you, Susan. When I think about it, it's people like you who have that attention to detail, who don't let it go, who keep on pushing, and don't allow everything to just move on. We need people like you. Actually, even when you go back to history, what happened in the Second World War, the Nuremberg trials, and so on, this was really because of a couple just not letting it go.
Right.
They just refused to let governments and everybody move on. And so, in this sense, are you concerned about your well-being? And there'll be a lot of people who are not happy about you talking and documenting this kind of stuff. Are you worried?
Well, I'd be silly not to be worried. Yes, I am concerned. the impact it will have, not on me so much, but my family. But I just can't let it go, because if there aren't some people like me that put the benefit to others ahead of my own safety, um, then the world won't be the kind of place that I'll want my grandchildren to live in. It's just it's just something I have to do, and I do know that anybody that knows me and they said, well, you're talking about this to anybody that wants to listen, and people do attack me, but I'm being attacked a lot less as time goes on. And I think it's probably because more and more people have become aware of how they were manipulated, how they were lied to, how it's just so many things that happen to people. And even if it's just one thing that happened to them, then they start to believe some of the other things that I'm saying. And I'll say on X, I was kicked off Twitter during the pandemic when I was saying these things. I was censored. I was kicked off. I was kicked off LinkedIn. When Elon Musk took over Twitter, I signed back up. I set up a new account, and I started to talk about it. And at first, I was being attacked all the time. I had to actually block people because the names I was being called, I wouldn't want to repeat. But over time, and now when I say any of these things, more of the comments are supportive. And the ones that do criticize me and attack, when I try to engage them and say, well, why do you think that way? They have no defense, which means theirs is just strictly emotional. They probably do believe what I'm saying. They just don't want to admit it to themselves. And I get that, because to be misled the way we all were, and I said I was misled, but not for very long. Like, it was just the very first few months where I thought the government was doing things. And remember, at the beginning, they did say they were going to make the vaccine available to anyone that wanted it. And they were going to focus on the elderly and those with coexisting morbidities. They never said that they were going to use the vaccine on young adults, and never said they were going to use it on pregnant women or children. And when they started to push that further down the age, that's when I really started to speak out.
There's a important thing that needs to be done now as we're closing out, Susan. Trust is shattered. And what's happening now is that the public is not trusting anything from government, from industry. And we have to somehow fix that. But I don't believe you fix it by pretending that there are not problems. You become open, you acknowledge, you help people to understand why, and you try and see if we can make a way forward. So far, I have not seen any country doing their inquisition that has built trust to the people who are concerned. What should industry, and I'm speaking to you now as an ex-industry person, what should or could industry do as a whole to help people find a way to trust again?
I think the only thing they can do is to basically demonstrate that they have done all the testing that they need to do. I do not think companies will go back and retest vaccines or any products that are already on the market. That just creates a whole slew of problems. As I said, that if they prove they weren't safe to begin with, you can't defend yourself when people start coming and trying to sue you for damages. But if industry takes a step back and develops the products, the new products, properly, and they go back and they do what's really needed, then I think the public may be brought around to trust them again. But I don't see that happening. And I think to prove, like I said, all I'm doing is discussing things that I observed. Well, I don't have proof of some of the stuff that I saw, like the reasons for it. All I know is it happened, but I can't say why it happened. And if we try to dig for the evidence to prove that there was, uh, you know, I don't know, illegal things happening, or there was collaboration between companies and regulators to damage the public, then the whole system is going to shatter. Doctors like you yourself will not be trusted because you're a doctor. People will lose trust in the entire system. So all we can do, I think, is show what went wrong and then try to move forward by fixing the system. But going back and trying to prove, or blame or point fingers, I don't think that is going to help. And if there's enough people who have been convinced that things have to be changed, we have to start putting the pressure on our governments to go back and review the regulations that have been changed, because these regulations are not the same as they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. They need to go back and they need to start evaluating the products that are already out there, do their risk benefit analyses, and stop thinking about the money that some companies are making. They have to stop protecting the companies. The companies will find ways of making money. But when the regulators and the governments are helping them to do that, that is where the trust is lost.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Susan. I mean, I know we're going to have to talk again because there is so much more that are in those diaries. And
Mm-hmm.
I know people will want to hear more. So we must arrange to have another detailed look at some of the other things around what you've been working on. So we really appreciate you, appreciate what you have done. That those diaries, as I say, make sure you put them in a bank vault and you keep them safe.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah. Put them in a safety deposit box.
Yeah.
That is exceptionally valuable because you're right. Nobody remembers exactly what happened in what sequence, and you've got it there
Yeah.
on record,
Yeah.
written down. Very valuable. So, thank you again. And I'll just ask you to wait with me while we do the outro. Thank you, everyone, for watching. And if you want more information about her, just look in the description and you will be able to find that. Have a great evening.
Bye, everybody.